In a hard-to-find corner of an Auckland graveyard, Grace Adams is finally coming to terms with how her sister Rebecca lost her life. It's part of Grace's personal crusade, a determination to help the world learn from an awful lesson. Grace's sister Rebecca perished along with 81 others in the fire which destroyed the Branch Davidian Compound in Waco, Texas 6 years ago. Also among the dead, 2 more of Grace's relatives. They had blindly followed David Koresh, a self-proclaimed messiah who seemed determined to fulfill his own prophecies of apocalypse.
And who's going to bring that book? So there'll be no excuses.
They talked about prophecies and end-time prophecy, and there was nothing heavy at first, and they talked about a kingdom being set up in the last days, and I think for me I thought, oh, this sounds great.
Tonight, from out of the ashes of Waco comes Grace's own story. A story of how she herself was imprisoned in the compound, how she made the escape to a new life, and how she finally returned to Waco to find out why her closest sister had apparently chosen a martyr's death.
I could hear a constant barrage of fire. There wasn't a fraction of a second there was not gunfire.
You better watch out. I'm God.
February 1993, federal agents stormed the headquarters of the Branch Davidian looking for illegal firearms. There was a gun battle. Cult members and agents were killed. Recent interviews with Koresh suddenly became hot property.
Well, you know what they think of me? They think I'm the son of God.
Do they?
Yeah.
The world quickly learned that David Koresh was a very determined man. He had predicted to his disciples that they'd be attacked. This, said Koresh, was his prophecy fulfilled. So who were the followers? His sect had attracted devotees from America, England, Australia and New Zealand. Originally from South Auckland, Neil Vainga and his Hawaiian wife, Margarita, who expressed the hope they all held.
Do you believe he's the son of God?
I hope he is.
They were joined in America by a relative, Rebecca Saipaia, beloved younger sister of Grace.
She had a real passion for the scriptures, and she used to always want to be around him and asking him questions, and she's just had such a passion for being around what he had to share.
In 1991, Grace moved to America to be with Rebecca and ended up at Mount Carmel. In spite of some early reservations, Grace too eventually found herself becoming caught up in Koresh's message, although his preaching style was strange.
He'd swear a lot, and I thought that was unusual for someone who's supposed to be God's son. And he would really cut people down. I think that's what I noticed. So I always tried to keep in the back so that wouldn't happen. It was usually whoever was sitting in front would get the brunt of his attacks, if you like.
So it was a real power trip thing?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Koresh is now known to have physically and sexually abused women and children in the compound. When Grace came here, she was aware of the hold he had over people, but says despite her reservations, she fell under his spell. But ultimately, there was a showdown between Grace Adams and David Koresh.
I had a dream. I went to David and told him about the dream, and he was clearly upset by what I had to say. He then called a meeting. Everybody came to the meeting, and he publicly ridiculed me in front of the people. I was then taken to a cabin. I was confined, beaten, and from there I later on found out that my sister Rebecca had been advised by David that what I had done was a threat to the people at Mount Carmel.
Here in the heat of a harsh Texas summer, it was a scene reminiscent of a Japanese prisoner of war movie. Grace Adams was confined to a cabin for 4 months, 23, 24 hours a day, allowed out for the occasional quick meal or 5-minute stroll around the compound. When they finally let her go, she flew to San Francisco, made such a scene on the plane, out of her head, that the police were called, and finally she was picked up by hospital staff wandering around a car park in San Francisco and admitted to hospital for 2 weeks' treatment of psychosis.
They found her mumbling to herself and praying blessings over her shoes. Admitted to a psychiatric ward, she had lost her identity.
They didn't know who I was. I was taken in as Jane Doe and they just called me Jane. They said, "Oh, Jane," and I'll just respond. And they said that they asked me what my name was and I just wouldn't tell them.
11,000 kilometres away in Auckland, Grace's sister Poya, who had herself escaped from Koresh's clutches 2 years earlier, finally got the call and flew to America to claim Grace from the psychiatric ward. The memories of beating and incarceration at Mount Carmel were still very real, but Grace had finally recalled who she was and that she had a home.
It was just amazing when Poya came on the phone. It was like, oh, you know, it's that breakthrough. It was, I do have family and people who love me and who miss me and who want me back.
Exhausted, Grace came home with Poya. 2 years later, they could only watch with horror as on April 19th, 1993, the tanks moved in and Mount Carmel exploded in flames. Rebecca, who was Grace and Poya's sister, was inside the compound, as were two of their other relatives.
All I could think of was my sister, Rebecca, because we knew she was there, and I had a sort of a hope that maybe she was somewhere else, but mostly that I knew that she was probably there.
Do you ever wonder how close you came to being there in that fire in 1993?
Yes, I do. And then I think the only reason why I didn't stay there was because I got sick, and that's the only reason that saved me. It was the fact that I was confined that caused me to leave. And then in leaving, I started to think more about it, and I thought, no. And I did mention that to Rebecca when she rang. I said, this cannot be it. I see so much pain and just indecision in the way that people's minds are twisted around like that. I don't think this is it, Rebecca.
And so began for Grace a personal quest to find out whether her sister went willingly to her death. There was a desire to help others avoid the trauma of being drawn into the clutches of suicidal cult leaders like David Koresh. In a moment, we're with Grace as she goes back to Waco to ask the questions of those who've turned Mount Carmel into one of the most breathtaking shrines in the world. Mount Carmel today is not totally deserted. An air of religious intensity still pervades the site, now overgrown, but still occupied by a few devotees of the Branch Davidian faith. Reminders of April 19th, 1993 are everywhere. Some of those who survived the fire have turned this land into a huge memorial. No bodies here, but a stone and a tree for each of the 82 dead. Debate raged for months as to whether the fires were triggered by tanks smashing their way in, or whether Koresh's followers started the blaze. Whatever the truth, many of the dead were found to have gunshot wounds, including David Koresh himself.
The heat was so intense, it kind of forced me down onto the floor. I was rolling around trying to protect my hands. I had them under my armpits.
Clive Doyle, now a kind of unofficial successor to Koresh, was one of the few who made it out of the inferno.
When I got out, I hadn't seen a thing. As I said, it was so pitch black, I didn't know anybody that even got out ahead of me. I thought I was the only one at first, and I found out 4 other guys had come out ahead of me.
His hands and forearms burned. Clive Doyle escaped for a time. Finally, he was arrested, charged with offences related to the siege, and then did jail time.
A huge number of people from within the compound had gunshot wounds. It sounds like a mass suicide. What do you think?
There were no plans of a mass suicide. I would not rule out that if somebody was in tremendous pain, maybe already wounded from outside perhaps, but some of them may have put them out of their mission. I'm not ruling that out, but I don't know of any situation. I didn't observe any of that happening.
Near where the fire raged, the memorial stone to 82 victims, including Rebecca Saipaia. Grace, looking for answers, came back to Waco on a 102-degree day. Clive Doyle's mum, Edna, a Koresh devotee, there to meet her.
That's,
Edna had made Grace a quilt to commemorate Grace's lost relatives.
that's Margarita, Neil, and Joanne, and this was my sister Rebecca. And Neil was my brother-in-law's brother.
As you made these quilts, what was going through your mind? I mean, do you believe these people died at their own hand or at someone else's hand?
They died at the hand of the government. They were murdered. There's no two ways about it. They were murdered.
But even though some reports on the tragedy blame the tanks for starting the fire, the gunshot wounds to so many of those who perished clearly suggest some cult members took their own lives or the lives of others. What Grace had been grappling with was the question, was her sister so mesmerized by Koresh she would have followed his orders to stay in a burning building? Clive Doyle doesn't believe so.
I've listened to some of the bug tapes they had, and you can hear people saying, quick, let's go this way, you know, and they go, oh, you can't go this way, it's blocked. And I think a lot of them were trying to get out. I mean, that's instinctive anyway, and to say that everybody just wanted to die is kind of ridiculous.
So,
If that was an agreed upon thing, then why did David send 30-something people out during the siege and 9 of us come out during the fire? And others that came out the back that didn't make it because they were shot or something like that. That doesn't sound like an agreed upon, let's all just lay down and die sort of thing.
did you ever feel that the only way that you could come out at the time would be for David to give you permission? You know, did you ever feel that if you came out prior to then you were, well, you know how it was, you had to listen to inspiration?
That played a part in it.
Later that day, Grace kept an appointment on a bridge over the Waco River. She'd meet Dan Maloney, a news cameraman who took the first dramatic pictures when the agents stormed Mount Carmel and found himself caught in the fearsome crossfire.
For the first 5 minutes, there wasn't a fraction of a second there wasn't gunfire. You could see the ATF on one side of the bus, crouching for cover. Never saw a Davidian. I never saw a gun, never saw a blind, open, or anything.
Right. So there was no gunfire. You didn't see or hear any gunfire from within the compound.
I saw and heard gunfire. I could hear bullets going over my head. They were going zing, zing, zing. I can hear them hitting the bus. My news unit took hits. I had bullet holes in my news unit.
Grace Adams wanted to know if Dan could shed light on what happened on the final awful day at Mount Carmel.
I had a sister. I had a sister in there and 2 relations. Do you have any idea why they would want to stay in there?
I have no reason to understand why they were there, why they stayed. My belief is they could have walked out, but I think David had such a strong hold over them that he wouldn't let them. And that's one thing I have disrespect for David about. Even at the end when the fire came down.
Yes.
You know, why let the children go through that? Because it's blind love. They follow their mothers.
Yes.
And let the children go through the agony and the torture of burning or suffocating to death. There's no reason for that.
Could Mount Carmel rise again, Grace Adams wonders? Are the beliefs of the Branch Davidian in Waco still so fanatical that another Koresh could pull together the remaining faithful? We'll talk to the guardians of the land, and you'll find they're still so struck on their original leader, they believe, to the depth of their being, that he's coming back.
It's going to be here, because this is where they died. He'll come back. As I say, whether I'm here to see it doesn't matter, but he'll be back. And when he comes back, all those people that are represented by the trees will be back too. And the ones that are still living, there's a lot, you know, scattered around the world that we don't, you know, can't meet with us here. But he definitely will.
Do you think people like Clive and Edna really listen to you when you talk?
No, not at all. No, not at all.
Their minds are pretty heavily made up, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you worry for them?
I do worry for them because, you know, anybody could come to them and
try and help them, but they'll still be pretty set in what they're believing. So it's a bit of a worry there.
They'd follow another David Koresh, wouldn't they?
I think so.
In a moment, in the final part of our story, Grace's new life, learning to forgive for what happened at Mount Carmel and preparing for a kind of fairy tale end to her story of struggle.
Grace, I just want to ask you if you will be my wife.
When journalists and investigators teased apart the threads of the Waco story, they came up with some conclusions which were quite shattering for Grace Adams and her family. There was, for example, evidence that her close relation Neil Vainga, originally of South Auckland, had been responsible for the mercy killing of 2 people within the Mount Carmel compound. Grace would learn the people Neil had allegedly shot were 2 men who'd been seriously injured during the original shootout with federal agents.
Can you believe that of Neil?
Just going by the way Rebecca was, and just by some of the comments that I've heard while I was in there, I would say yes, in obedience to the instruction given by Koresh, if that was where the instruction came. Yes.
It's pretty heavy devotion, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Neil, of course, ultimately died in the fire along with his wife and Grace's sister, Rebecca. So for Grace, the process has been one of deciding whether to forgive David Koresh for placing her loved ones in such awful situations.
I forgive him, or whoever else that that reason why they made their choices to do that, and that's something that it's quite a peace that's come to me with coming back here, just knowing, okay, this is where it stays and the forgiveness is there. You're probably asking, so what good thing can come out of Waco? Well, I'll just invite you to see what good things can come out of Waco. My sister's husband's brother.
Although it's tough emotionally, Grace now thrusts herself into a variety of situations in which she can share her story. Given her recovery, she now sees it as her role in life to help counsel people about the dangers of mind-controlling organisations. People searching for a scrap of hope as they look for loved ones who've gone missing abroad consult Grace about what to do if they believe a relative may have fallen into the clutches of a cult. So what good did come out of Waco? Well, Grace regained her mind and found a real faith, even though it took persecution and a spell in hospital, and she was ultimately reunited with family who did escape Mount Carmel.
I give glory back to the Lord because he was the one that brought her through it all, through the healing process. She had a part to play in being willing to be healed. And I felt this is what the Lord can do in a life that has been damaged almost to the point of destruction. And I would not want anything to happen, anyone to go through the same experience as she did.
What else came out of Waco? A very nice ending up the Auckland Sky Tower. While recovering from her Waco ordeal, Grace met an American man, Leonard, who specialises in helping people who've been caught up in oppressive cults. Grace and Leonard fell in love, and he came to Auckland with a question for her.
I want to ask you if you will be my wife. Will you marry me?
Yes, I will. I love you, and yes, I will marry you.
There'll be ceremonies and celebrations in both New Zealand and America.
For me, this was like the, so the icing on the cake. Sort of like
the whole cake.
the whole cake.
The whole cake.
This has just topped everything off for me insofar as Waco goes. This is the end. This is the complete thing that God's brought me through, and God was gracious enough to allow Leonard into my life and as a husband for me. So I'm thrilled, and I think we'd make a good team too.
In the end, Grace may never get to find out exactly what was going through Rebecca's mind in those final hours at Mount Carmel. She says she bears David Koresh no malice. Instead, she says she chooses to focus on the truth she found during the experience. The importance, she says, of not trusting one spiritual leader alone, because such men have a way of taking people to disaster.
There's a scripture in the Bible. It talks about God giving us his mercy and comfort when we need it, so that we in turn might be able to give that same mercy and comfort to others when they are needing it. So I want to be able to be available for people who are needing any type of help, whether they've been in cults or whatever. That's what I see this experience to be of value for. Yeah.
Grace Adams will get married to Leonard in just a few weeks' time. They'll live in America, where they hope to jointly continue their work aiding people who've been affected by the likes of David Koresh.